he's going to outline his thinking on Russia's near abroad and looking at some of the countries in the near abroad and why they're pulled one way or the other and what's tugging in which direction and how they see the West, how they see their other neighbours like China, Turkey, and Iran. Then Anna will respond, and Anna's a great expert on many of these issues as well in King's College London. So firstly, Tom, could you please kick us off and then we'll move to Anna.
Right, well, thank you so much, Charles. Greetings to Ian, if you're with us, and thank you generally to CER for hosting us today. It's really great to be here. Although I live in London, I'm affiliated with Brussels, so it's nice to do actually something in my actual home city. So thanks to you. Also, this report was also, I should mention, I'm Carnegie Europe, but also thanks to a fellowship I did at IWN in Vienna. So without them, it wouldn't have been possible either to do some in-depth research. And for my topic, I kind of chose this dual perspective that I've had in my career. Someone who in the late 80s studied in the 90s, lived in Russia, and then from early 2000s really stopped going to Russia. I was actually banned from Russia from 2005, and concentrated on other countries, particularly in the South Caucasus, but also countries like Ukraine and Moldova. So I have the kind of dual perspective of Russia looking out and then looking in. And I decided to write this report about the kind of other neighbours of Russia who are not Ukraine. And I titled it the end of the near abroad, because I do think that notion is now dead. I think even when it comes to Ukraine, you know, Russia is no longer thinking of it as near abroad; it's thinking of it as ours. And so I prepared some slides. Octavia is going to hopefully do that for us. So my sort of first slide, please. So I start with this, I think, which is invasion of Ukraine was a turning point, obviously for Russia, for Ukraine, but for many other countries as well. And I think I would say it was a moment in which most of these other post-Soviet countries stopped viewing, if they ever had, but certainly it was a turning point in viewing Russia as a kind of metropolis. And this ad, which aired on Kazakh television in November 2022, I think encapsulated it rather nicely. What you see is one of these, an exemplar of these tens of thousands of middle-class Russians who were fleeing Russia for other countries, which was obviously a shock to Russians' pride that these lesser countries were receiving all these Russian professionals. And what you see is this man on the right, this curly-haired Russian young backpacker, crawling, creeping across the Kazakh steppe, looking very hot and sweaty. And this proud Kazakh gallops up on his horse in traditional dress and passes him a bar of chocolate. And then he says, "Что это?" And then he says in Kazakh, with Russian subtitles, "It's vkus svobody," it's the taste of freedom. And this is a brand of Kazakh chocolate. So I have no comment on how free Kazakhstan is vis-a-vis Russia. But I think the cultural point, I think, was encapsulated in this ad, that Russians were choosing Kazakhstan over Russia, even if it wasn't in many ways not equally undemocratic. It was a different sovereignty. It was an escape for them. This was a moment about a rebalancing in the relationship, and I think this is the underlying context. But then, of course, it gets much more complicated, and you have this kind of hierarchy within Russia of how they view, which I think has been there ever since the 19th century, of how they view different former imperial lands, different neighbours. If Ukraine is absolutely vital and front and centre in the Russian imagination, obviously places like Tajikistan aren't. So next slide, please. Okay, so not Russia's backyard, I think that should say. And multiple neighborhoods. I think this is a key point, which I think is an obvious point, but it isn't perhaps made as much as it should. That these countries, Central Asia, the South Caucasus, they're all in multiple neighborhoods. And that trend of regionalization, I think, has been enhanced since 2022. When it comes to Central Asia, obviously, China is the other key big regional power and neighbor. When it comes to South Caucasus, it's kind of reverting to its traditional kind of status as a geographical crossroads. There's Turkey, Iran there, a bit of China. The EU is there in a way it hasn't been before. And Moldova, over to the left, just about on our screen, is obviously the most geographically well advantaged of all these countries in the sense that it borders the European Union. I'm not talking in this report about Ukraine, which I think is a special case, and Belarus, which is, I think, a different special case, unfortunately for Belarus. East-West connectivity has been a theme suddenly, which I think has been around for 30 years, but has again come back on the agenda, this idea of a middle corridor, which is neither the northern route via Siberia or the southern route via the Suez Canal in east-west trade. But if you look at the map, you can also see all the logistical challenges of that corridor, particularly the fact you have to cross the Caspian Sea by ship. But for sure, east-west connectivity is now certainly back on the agenda. But as I will say in a bit, north-south connectivity is also very important. Next slide, please. So this is also about decline of Russian soft power. Perception of Russia, I think, has shifted in many, many countries. And I'll be particularly, I think, talking a bit, if one country more than many today, which is Armenia, where I think that shift has been the most dramatic. Obviously, that started before 2022. It started with the 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where Armenia was hoping for more Russian support than it received. But this is an opinion poll, comparative opinion polls from IRI, going back to 2018. How would you evaluate the current state of the relationship between Armenia and Russia? 2019, 93% of Armenians said good, 31% in 2023 saying good. Thank you for that. So a dramatic collapse in trust in Russia. I think this is the key point. Russia is, in many ways, still strong, but there's a perception of unreliability, particularly as a security patron. Next slide, please. Is that working? Well, I'll carry on talking. I mean, I suppose when a key argument I make in the paper is that when you look at institutional relationships and the Russian-led institutions, the CSTO, founded in 2002, I think has definitely outlived its usefulness as far as most other members are concerned. Oh, there we go. Likewise, the CIS. So I think the CSTO is in crisis, and I think the way that Armenia tried in September 2022 to invoke Article 4 of the CSTO Charter, which is a bit like NATO's Article 5, when there was an Azerbaijani incursion across the international border, there was no response from the CSTO, and I think that was indicative of the fact that institution is not NATO. It's not a collective organization at all. It's a kind of Russian-led organization without any really fundamental commonalities between its member states. Likewise, the CIS, but the Eurasian Economic Union has actually, interestingly, I would argue, functioned more effectively for the other partners since the war began, and we can talk about that a bit in a moment. Next slide, please. So Russia, as I say in this slide, both weaker and more dangerous, failing as a security guarantor in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. Also worth mentioning that the CSTO, Russia, did not intervene in the border conflict clashes between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan in 2022. This is the unprecedented lowering, well, it's already been lowered, the ending of a Russian mission, peacekeeping mission in post-Soviet space, the first time that's ever happened in Karabakh in June 2024. That mission was supposed to run until the end of 2025, but the Russians, first of all, as it were, stood on their hands as the Azerbaijanis took over Nagorno-Karabakh last year, and now have withdrawn that mission more than a year early. And I think that's again an indication of a shift in Russian priorities away from hard security in the Caucasus, more towards treating the South Caucasus and I would say Central Asia as well as economic regions of economic interest rather than pure hard security interest. So which led the same day as the Russians pulled out in the Armenian parliament, Nikol Pashinyan, Armenian prime minister, said Armenia will leave the CSTO. He didn't specify how or when. It was a fairly impulsive comment, but it's an indication of intentions. So next slide, please. Don't worry. So again, to sort of make the point about the economy, this is again 2 more slides showing you how the importance of the 3 South Caucasus countries to Russia in the light of Western sanctions, in the light of what they see as a Western economic encirclement. On the left, you see the fact that the Azerbaijani railways are being upgraded. This is to allow an increase in Russian freight. Russia sees Azerbaijan, I think, as its most important overland route to Turkey, Iran, and the Persian Gulf. And Azerbaijan is, as I said, not only an east-west, playing an east-west role here, but a north-south role as well. Quite enhanced connections and discussions between Russia and Azerbaijan over these issues. And another aspect in which the South Caucasus is important to Russia is as, given Western sanctions, given that these countries are not under Western sanctions, as a re-exporter of many goods, primarily consumer goods to Russia. That's a car market in Gyumri in Armenia. Armenians are not suddenly buying lots more Mercedes, but Russians are buying Mercedes through countries like Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. Georgia, I think the enhanced economic relationship between Russia and Georgia is also one of the stories of the post-2022 landscape. Resumption of flights to Georgia, increased trade, and also Georgian Dream marketing Tbilisi as a kind of haven for Russian capital, Russian assets, opening its banks to Russian money. So that's certainly what's going on. Now, just to, I have a lot in my report about Russia, but I won't, not enough time to say that. So just a couple of slides about Russia. I would, I kind of try to, this is my contribution, my own personal reflections on how the Ukraine war started. And I for one, do not believe it was inevitable. I do believe it was a war of choice. I do not believe that the Russian public was asking for war. But of course, once it started, the dynamics in Russia, of course, changed overnight. But this, I think this poll from Levada is interesting. Russia as a great power versus Russia as a normal country. Basically, Russians were asked a kind of binary question: would you prefer to see your country as a great power which is feared and respected in the world, or as a normal country which prioritizes high living standards? And as you can see, only at one point in this graph, prior to 2022, and I think you can all see what point that is, that's early 2014, annexation of Crimea, did the great power narrative briefly top the other. So I think, and let's recall that it was a phrase that you heard in Russia a lot in the 1990s: Russia should become a normal country, a post-imperial country. And this was a narrative that Alexei Navalny, I think, took up and acquired popularity over. Navalny I would describe as a kind of anti-imperialist nationalist who also kept on repeating this phrase as Russia should be a normal country, we should not get entangled in foreign adventures. You know, he even, as we know, took it to the point that he said Russia should abandon the North Caucasus. So I think that's you know, part of the societal context to this, and I have a lot in the report about different visions. I kind of try and make distinctions between Primakov and Putin. Both of them statists, but I think Primakov a statist who also didn't believe in the use of military force in the neighborhood, whereas Putin clearly did. And next slide, please. And although there's far too little time for this, I think my point about Putin, I think, is that I'm for sure I think he is a man who holds imperialist views about Russia, about the neighborhood, but I don't think he's and this is probably a rather scary point, he's as imperialist as many. I think for him imperialism is if it's anything, above all, a legitimizing narrative of his own rule, that he's never so much an imperialist as when he becomes the emperor. That Putin's Russia is almost a kind of narrowing of the equation, that the state started with the state interest, then became the kind of inner circle interest, and now his personal interest in pursuing these policies and keeping himself in power. This is the famous speech to the Federal Assembly in 2005 when he talks about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the major geopolitical disaster of the century. And I think it's worth remembering that actually he gave that speech in the context of talking about the survival of the Russian state. The epidemic of disintegration should not affect the Russian state. I should move on. Plenty to say on that, but just I think if we look at regime survival as being the kind of the bottom line for all these one-party states and rulers. So next slide, please. Then I see you can see how it's easier to do elite compacts with other post-Soviet leaders. So this would be a distinction I would draw. In a country where the regime equates the regime interest equates the national interest, it's far easier to do business with people like these two gentlemen, Ilham Aliyev on the right, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev on the right, and they're both very much leaders cut from a post-Soviet cloth or Soviet cloth. And both of them studied at MGIMO. Both of them, I think, are probably more Russian speakers at home, at least, than they are of their national language. But they are, you know, when people push back against the idea that we shouldn't call this the post-Soviet space, I sort of agree. But when I look at some of these regimes, I think they're actually very, very post-Soviet, rather the regimes, if not the countries. So I think this is a key point. When the regime interest is said to be the same as the national interest, then you can do business with Putin. And both of these two men have been doing a lot of business with Putin since the war began, which doesn't mean that they've also been doing business with the West. But I think they and the Russians understand each other's red line extremely well. So next slide, please. And this sort of, again, I would say, if geography matters, then regime type also matters enormously. That's, I guess, following on from the previous point. And I think recent relationships in the breakdown in the relationship between Armenia and Belarus, both members of the CSTO, the Eurasian Economic Union, on paper, two close partners, I think is an illustration of this. Azerbaijan and Belarus have now got a much stronger partnership than before. In May 2024, Lukashenko not only visited Azerbaijan, but visited Karabakh, Shusha. And interestingly, the Armenian government is now openly conducting business with the exiled Belarusian de facto president, shall we call her, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and there she is just last week in Vilnius meeting the Armenian Foreign Minister Ararat Mirzoyan with the state flag in the background. So I think this is again an illustration that of how, if you think you're a democracy, you're in this post-2022 context. That's one reason not to trust Russia, because you derive your legitimacy somewhere else, and you're looking to do business with other democratic leaders. So just one final slide. A distinction, I think, between post-Soviet leaders who we saw and these who I would describe as non-Soviet leaders, all of them born in the 1970s. None of the kind of institutional networks or social connections with USSR and Russia, none of them studied in Russia. Their worldview is very different, and obviously three extremely different leaders. Maya Sandu, Nikol Pashinyan, and Vladimir Zelensky. But in this sense, I think they all have commonalities. And I think this is one reason why they're making the choices that they are. Now, I'm conscious that I haven't actually talked about Georgia in this presentation, because Georgia actually somehow is a bit of a special case. It's sort of a hybrid case. It's got the society is definitely post-Soviet, but non-Soviet, I would say, but the leadership is post-Soviet, and that's obviously the dynamic that's playing out in Georgia at the moment, and which is one reason why this October election there is so consequential. But I'll stop there. I think I've overrun the time I promised. So these slides are sort of meant as a kind of provocation and stimulus for debate. There's obviously much more to say, but I'll be interested.
Thank you very much, Tom. That's a great overview. Sure, very interesting indeed. Anna, your specialities, I'm told, include working on the impact of the war in Ukraine on Russia's political and social evolution, and also you're doing a lot of work on how the delayed and geopolitical consequences of the USSR breaking up are affecting conflicts between and within post-Soviet states. That latter part is particularly relevant to today's discussion. So do tell us what you think about it.
And you've also did a very good paper on Central Asia not long ago.
Thank you very much for this brilliant introduction. Yes, and of course, thank you, Tom, for a very interesting paper and very timely. I think that's the good time to actually take stock of what is near broad and what we should replace it with. If it's kind of Russia's neighborhood, that's perhaps not a very much of a kind of good term, because Russian neighborhood somehow has such countries as Finland and North Korea, which have even less common. You mentioned Eurasia, but again, it's a very blurred term, are quite often associated with Eurasian cuisine when nobody knows what it exactly is. So I will talk more about other states rather than Russia per se, because I think that's very kind of interesting subject now. Firstly, the expectations were when the war in Ukraine broke out, that Russia would really lose out in all of its neighbors, that Russia would be very weak, very much kind of resented, hated, and that would be kind of the last nail in the coffin of the Soviet kind of era. What we have seen is not that's happening. We've seen in some ways our relationship became more complicated. So in some aspects, it has strengthened. And there are reasons for that why. What you mentioned in the paper, what it is that Moldova and Tajikistan have in common rather than just being part of this historical legacy. And I would say that there is something there. And I will call it the status quo forces. What is status quo? Forces which generally kind of resist neoliberal change. Stability, stable jobs, state pensions, cheap public utilities, holidays, socialist values, which at least Soviet system proclaimed, civic nation, against ethnic nationalism based on ethnicity, so rights of working people, that all create that kind of status quo position. It is very difficult to articulate it, but in some kind of programmatic documents, but it is nevertheless something which kind of people do feel dear, even in some forces which feel kind of dear. It's partly Sovietized. Russia there is something which kind of signifies that model. Maybe some imagined Russia, not necessarily all of it's kind of real, but that's I think still an important some kind of bond which is recreated through generations. It's not necessarily a phenomenon of people who lived through Soviet experience. Of people in their 20s can be bearers of that. That creates divisions in the countries which are where their elites are kind of taking their countries away from Russia, because that kind of status quo milieu is sort of not zero sum. They are not against the West, but they also do not see a value of breaking up beneficial ties with Russia, because they do not see that it will be in their interest. So I would say this kind of bridge position, being in the middle, kind of milking two cows, if you kind of look at it cynically, is something which is fairly common aspiration, even in the countries which, like Moldova now, is quite divided over the European choice. So the other factor is that looking at Russia from Russia's position now, Russian leaderships now make strategic calculations over the values of individual countries, certain countries. It does have regional approach in Central Asia. It's now really kind of running with this 1+5 formats, because it's also a vehicle of some of the large-scale infrastructure projects. Russia can offer tangible economic deals, the benefits to these countries. It's the only high-income country in the post-Soviet space. Of course, we exclude Baltics. It has, of course, cultural significance. Certainly, some countries have taken steps to ban Russian channels. Moldova, especially Georgia, to some extent. But I have to say that most people try to watch Russian channels not because of the news programs, but because they like Russian entertainment. And even among the publics, where kind of politically, publics might be very politically minded the other way, but Russian entertainment still kind of prevails. It does kind of reproduce a cultural bond, maybe more than even passive knowledge of the Russian language. So yes, relations in some ways strengthened. Russia became an important investor, an important infrastructure investor. As Tom just mentioned, regional connectivity, connectivity through Iran and to Iran has become important. So gas pipelines are being constructed, railways. So we have not seen it to that extent before the start of the war in Ukraine. We would have thought that it would be the trend would be the contrary, but that's what is sort of happening now. Then, in terms of your point about elite change, I would say that it is certainly post-Soviet elite has kind of a different take rather than people who were born in a different era and had different kind of education. But we also have seen two reasonably young leaders coming to power in Kyrgyzstan and in Turkmenistan. None of them were educated in Russia. Yes. One, Sadir Japarov, came on the waves of social kind of protests. He is a graduate of physical education college in Kyrgyzstan. He has taken his country even more down towards sort of authoritarian route, kind of more following Russian model, sometimes quite directly, rather than his sort of more Sovietized predecessors. So, changing leaders might change them in quite unpredictable ways. And I would also say that the most interesting cases are Armenia and Moldova. With Armenia, certainly the war in Karabakh has left a very large imprint on the whole society and politics. But I would also say that the Russian leadership followed more the Soviet tradition, where Azerbaijan was kind of the most important player in the South Caucasus, because in the late 80s, Soviet leadership at that time took very much kind of the position of Baku over the position of Karabakh Armenians and Yerevan over that. So we are seeing kind of return of that pattern. And in terms of CSTO and the crisis over there, firstly, Russia always recognized territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. So within the CSTO mandate, they could not intervene if the conflict was in Karabakh.
Yeah, but that was 2020, but 2022 was a bit different.
Yeah, so that certainly Armenian side is very much agreed with all this situation, because it's also kind of there were military action style on the borders of Armenia and Azerbaijan proper. Then it was an expectation that they would certainly withdraw. And Pashinyan and other Armenian politicians implied several times that that's the intention. But it was not quite clear what would be the alternative offer. Who would be, if, say, for example, Armenia leaves, which is quite a drastic step. What would then the West step in, or beyond some showcase weapons deliveries, which really do not mean that much. So in that sense, we have seen quite sort of a hesitant position of our Armenian leadership, and still trying to somehow stay in this non-zero-sum game, not making very drastic choices, not leaping into something which might, in the end, leave us in the region with no friends. We can say that to some extent Georgia is a friend, but it's not a friend which can sort of offer a lot in terms of tangible. The other thing which I think is quite important, and which still kind of ties countries to some extent together and ties them in Russia, the depth of elite networks, and which have been recreated in the post-Soviet times, and regional institutions, even CSTO, which I take is not terribly effective, are the vehicles to create that kind of networks which go on the much beyond the just Putin and pottery, but go to the heads of departments, which goes to academies of sciences, economic enterprises, railway ministries, and all this. People know each other, and maybe the only country which really doesn't have that networks to a great extent would be Georgia, because very, very significant elite change and also falling out with Russia at a very early stage. So that, but otherwise, that's something which is being recreated, and security networks still continue. That would that's why, for example, the terrorist cooperation continues regardless of what the political fallout. Moldova, I think, is now in the most interesting, the most precarious, the most sensitive time of its development, because now it seems like it's a moment of choice. Yeah, there will be presidential election, there will be referendum on the vote. Interesting public opinion figures this year, and this International Republican Institute now show that the kind of Russia-friendly views are maybe increasing. 57% of people feel no threat from Russia, and almost 60% think that Russia is the most important political partner for Moldova. And 59% have a negative opinion of NATO. So that means that, yes, and the prevailing, absolutely prevailing position is neutrality. Being with both Russia and the West, being a bridge, benefiting from both. And I would say that's something which is the status quo position. But what it will do would be unclear. So just to conclude, I would say those forces in the for post-Soviet countries, well, Ukraine will take out there, but include Belarus, are those which are not very keen on neoliberal project, which are more comfortable with traditional values, traditional social order, and they resist change. So if pro-Russian forces in the West are more kind of challenging the existing order, they are more kind of agent disrupting. That kind of post-Soviet space is much more about preservation of what they think they have and what they like. And we also have to say that maybe the neoliberal project is not for everybody, and maybe that's also a position which is shared across societies. And in that sense, Russia, real or imagined, sort of symbolizes that.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. That's great. We've got a lot of people watching online. If they'd like to either raise their hand metaphorically on the screen, or send in a question in the chat function. We've got one question on Georgia already. That were two questions. The first one, let's start with the questions in the room, then we'll come to the people online. John Love.
Thank you, John Love, Chatham House. Firstly, just a very quick vocabulary question, Tom. Is zone of privileged interests still in vogue? That was Medvedev back in 2008, if I remember correctly.
Well, I mean, obviously, all of these terms are still in vogue in Russia. So obviously, when I'm saying the end of the near abroad, that's a notion that that I'm sure Russians a challenge, and for sure in 2008, yeah, Medvedev indeed used this term, zone of privilege. Yeah, you have the exact words.
Yeah, it's after the Russia.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I thought it summarised things in a nice way. But sorry, my more substantive question was: you said that Putin is not as imperialist as many. But I mean, leaving aside the war in Ukraine, he's a man who compared himself, if I remember correctly, to Peter the Great, and seems to have certain ambitions. But when you say it's not as imperialist as many, are you thinking of Dugin or
No, I'm thinking that there is a sort of, well, I mean, obviously we can get into interesting debates on terms. I mean, there is a kind of fringe beyond Putin. I mean, some of it is obviously nationalist, which is not necessarily the same as imperialist. Some of it is Russian ethno-nationalist. I think Putin's conversion to Russian ethno-nationalism, if it is such a conversion, is comparatively recent. Obviously, it's difficult that those two things are hard to balance, because obviously, particularly when you're living in a multi-ethnic country. But yes, I do. I don't. Well, personally, and interesting that others for other things. I don't see much ideological depth in Putin. I mean, I think he believes in his own power. I think he believes in Russian power. I think he believes in might is right. I think he believes in a multipolar world where Russia has privileged interests. But everything that he's written on history and whatever is pretty second-rate and derivative, and so it's almost flattering to call Putin an imperialist. Imperialist implies a certain vision, a certain consistency, which I don't see in Putin.
Let's take one more question, and then we'll go to the on-screen questions. James Nixie.
Thank you, James, Chatham House. Thank you very much indeed, both. Really fascinating and eminently sensible stuff, as I expect from you both. But I mean, the region seems to be suffered by being an ex-region. It started as an anachronism. It was something, and it's not really something anymore. That aside, therefore, since you've been doing this for a long time, both of you, I just wonder if you don't mind speculating a little bit about the future, and where do you see this place in 25 years? Will it still be an ex-region, a regional backwater, or do you think it's actually got potential to be something quite extraordinary, more than we've seen it? I mean, we're all disappointed, I think, by how it's turned out since 1991, one way or another. I just wonder if you don't mind speculating a little bit, because it's inevitably speculation, and the war is a massive variable, obviously, about how you think this might be in your dotage.
Tom, I mean, thank you, James. I mean, I do think that is the impossible question. What will things be like in 2 years? I think is actually very hard. And I think, getting back to the point that Russia is both weak, I would argue, weaker and more dangerous and more unpredictable. I think this for me is the kind of the key unpredictable variable. And again, what happens in Ukraine obviously will determine so much. And I think a lot of what's happened, the way the Georgian regime has behaved, is not that they seek. I wouldn't describe it as an alignment policy with Russia. I would describe it as an appeasement policy with Russia. That they see Russia as a potential threat, and they are appeasing Russia in order to preserve what they've got. To get back to the preservation story that Anna was setting out. But that could all change quite quickly in Georgia, and even if we just look at Georgia, there's so many different paths that we take in the next few months. The Georgian dream could win the election by fair means or foul. The Western trajectory could be over. They could be looking to do deals with Russia, even though there's someone like Caucasus, or a completely different trajectory, a rather more messy outcome in which they don't win the election. The European trajectory stays on track, and then possibly Russia. But then again, if Russia does better in Ukraine, that's more threatening to Georgia. So there's so many variables there that I'm afraid I'm going to have to duck your question. But I do think I really take on board Anna's point that we have to look at. We all have to be sociologists to a certain degree when we look at this region. We have to look at these elite networks, the way that societies change and don't change their economic interests. And again, poverty, I think, is a key issue here. And again, it's this kind of trap that if you don't have this kind of big motor like the European Union taking these Central East European countries out of poverty and building a new middle class there with some mixed results, but I mean, I think, basically positive results. If you don't have that, then people get stuck in a poverty trap where their economic, you're going to end up, if you're a Georgian or Armenian farmer, you're going to be ending up selling your goods to Russia because that's your natural market. You're not going to be, unfortunately, with the EU.
Oh, okay, yeah, 25 years ago. Yeah, well, I don't have to be responsible for my words because I'm probably not likely to be around. So I can engage in wide speculation. The one factor is the rise of China. And if China in 25 years would become the most economically and politically important power, and the driving up the whole kind of Asian neighborhood, Vietnam, and Russia would also be kind of part of that emerging kind of global center. And if we would not look at the US as the center of kind of global power, wealth, innovation, and everything, then that would it would transpire toward the region which is on the border with China. Russia would benefit, Central Asia would benefit, Azerbaijan. That would kind of reshape the proximity, of what is kind of rising and what is maybe going down. If you're, well, okay, I wish we all live in Europe. I wish Europe well, but we do not. It doesn't look like we're doing as well as we thought we would. So that would kind of change the equation from how it was seen when, for example, when I started as a young researcher. In that scenario, I think the countries which are following more kind of state-driven pro-stability model would be benefiting. Now we see the pattern that countries which cooperated with Russia more perform better economically. Living standards in Belarus are better than Moldova, despite a massive, of course, European package. I would also say that these countries would, well, talking about Central Asia, perhaps more would be less reliant on labor migration and would be able to develop their own economies, which will satisfy the citizens. I do not think that it will be some kind of supranational state of European Union type, or that recreate the Soviet Union or something like that. But I would think that they would probably cooperate more, even more than what they do now. And specifically on Georgia, okay, it's a bit of a wildcat scenario, but I would also think that it's not impossible that the Georgian leadership eventually makes some kind of pact with Russia, that Russia gets South Ossetia, which is important for Russia for security purposes, not purposes, and hands Abkhazia back to Georgia on some kind of terms acceptable to both parties. Because well, South Ossetia is de facto annexed, Abkhazia is not. It is still kind of thing. So that's that may be the what the territorial kind of reconfiguration would be. I think generally the trends would be maybe weaker for Russia's European neighborhood. But of course, war in Ukraine is a big variable, and how long it will go and how it will end, it also would be one of the factors. Yes, the last prediction. Putin is more likely to die.
Okay.
And his successor is more likely to think what's better for Russia and try Chinese way of economic reform without reforming political institutions, rather than turning towards a liberal democracy.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back in 25 years and ask you if your predictions turn out to be true or not.
Yeah, Putin is still alive.
Everyone's still alive. Okay, let's go. We've got 4 questions on the screen, 2 of them from Roland Freudenstein. I'll read some of them out.
One from Ian as well.
Yes, we'll start with Roland's first question. We from the Free Russia Foundation believe that any future Russian democracy will by definition have to be post-imperial, so the near abroad could not be revived, and only Russian recognition of all neighbours as partners would guarantee a democratic Russia itself. How do you see this? Let me go to Roland's second question, then we'll have a gap. To Anna Matveeva, is there one neoliberal project? Isn't the essence of Western thinking that countries can choose their political system, their alliances, and also their societal values? Asking for a friend. Let's do the other questions while we got them up, and then we'll come back to our panelists for all of them. From Margot Rietzler, thank you for your insights. It's an interesting discussion. Could you provide more information on the Georgian case, particularly in the run-up to the upcoming elections? Do you have any predictions or thoughts concerning them? Thanks. Finally, Ian, a long question from Ian. Tom made the interesting point that the leaders of Armenia, Moldova, and Ukraine are young enough to have grown up in independent countries. Almost all the other countries are led by people who were formed in the Soviet system. Will generational change, when it comes, lead inevitably to weaker ties between these other countries and Russia? Has the Kremlin accepted that? Will Moscow keep trying to coerce countries back into the near abroad? Do we know what younger Russians think about the near abroad? Would you, starting with Tom, to pick up any of those questions you want? Not necessarily.
Well, I mean, Georgia, I think I sort of began to answer it for sure. You know, I think we can all agree that the elections in October are going to be very consequential, and you've got an interesting situation where you have a ruling party which is increasingly unpopular, but an opposition which is also very weak. So what gives, you know, is there, does the street protests, which were massive, much bigger than the ruling party anticipated, did they catalyze into a kind of opposition vote at the elections? Or does Georgian Dream have enough state capacity to mobilize a vote behind it and win an unprecedented 4th term? I'm afraid I can't give you a prediction, but I think it's going to be a much more contested election than we've seen in Georgia for many years, and a messy one. You know, there are, and I think what we can predict is that the contestation will not end after the election, whatever the result. There will be this contestation between Georgian Dream and these pro-European forces will continue. On the kind of generational issue, yeah, I mean, I do think that those use the phrase, I think, about elite networks, Anna, and I do think those are breaking down with every generation, and because of the multiple neighbourhoods, people have other places to study, other places to work. The EU is obviously a more attractive place to do business and study in for young professionals. I don't know about Central Asia and China, but that's also provides alternatives. So in that sense, it is a kind of gradual dilution, I would argue, of the kind of Russia as the metropolis, which is where I started. So I do think that will, you know, with each generation, that will begin to tell. I do think it's also happened in Russia, well, beginning to happen, which is why I wanted to show that slide about. I do think that the younger generation in Russia was increasingly post-imperial and did want to live in a quote-unquote normal country, but obviously that project has been completely blown away by Ukraine. So I do think there's a generational change, but I also, unfortunately, think I'm more pessimistic than I was a couple of years ago when I first started to think about this project, about how long that cyclical change will take to happen.
Anna?
Okay, I will start with very last question from Ian about what younger Russian thinks. Yeah, if we're talking about population in general, rather than what Russian politicians and business leaders think, it's a very different thing. But in terms of a kind of general kind of stuff, people view these neighborhood countries as a source of labor migration, and immigration is as unpopular in Russia as it is in Europe. That's how they encounter people from the abroad countries. Maybe less now from Moldova. Moldova labor migrants now mostly go to the EU because they have visa-free travel, and many Moldovans have Romanian citizenship. But of course, they have different niches, and some of them are more in the service sector. But that's how they they definitely do not see them as with the exception of Ukrainian and Belarusians, who are much more culturally integrated. They do not see them as somebody with whom we should all somehow unite or integrate. So there is no kind of public support for some kind of recreation, any regional unity in any which would create more labor migrants staying in Russia. It is much more of a kind of thing. This course is how you make sure that they do not settle here. So that's that's quite a tough issue in society, and I think it's not that much appreciated in our discourse in the West. Neoliberal project, yes, I think it does have a shape. I think radical market economy, privatization programs benefited, yes, professional middle class, benefited some oligarchs. It has disadvantaged quite a lot of ordinary people, farmers, workers, closing down of industries, done relocation of jobs, more reliance on agriculture. European part actually has pretty definitive key complementaire, which the countries will have to adhere to, and with very stringent technical benchmarks. Okay, we will see how they will be applied to Ukraine. It's a war-torn country, but I think yes, it is one project, and I think it is pretty obvious what it is. Transatlantic integration is also part of that. But also, certain values, positions on gender issues, gender rights, it's also kind of part of that.
Okay, we've got 4 people to raise their hand. We've got time for everybody to ask a question. First, Luigi Scazzieri.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Tom and Anna. My question is something we quite briefly touched. So we briefly discussed the possibility of Russian military action against Georgia, for example, of course, depending on how the conflict in Ukraine progresses. But what about the possibility, for example, of Russian action in Central Asia, specifically towards Kazakhstan? Is something that you see in Putin's rhetoric, for example, or in Russian debate? And what would the response to that kind of pressure be on part of Kazakhstan, for example?
Let's take some other questions before we come back to the panelists. Councillor Glod.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Thank you, Tom and Anna. I have a question about the Eurasian Economic Union. Anna, you mentioned about the recreation of this elite framework networks, and Tom, you also said that, unlike the CER, Eurasian Union seems to be doing really well. And I'm wondering how you see it currently, what's behind it, and how you see the future of it. And what I mean is that I think we are not really getting the information on what kind of various agreements are being signed. A lot of it is private, undisclosed information. We know that Kazakhstan, for example, was unhappy, and so was Belarus in the past, because lots of these agreements they had, they clearly benefited Russia. But at the same time, there is, for example, in Belarus, there is a big worry that through these legal agreements, that even if Belarus is not de jure part of Russia, when a new government comes in, it will be very hard to unravel these agreements, because there is a lot of legal power and it's kind of very slow absorption of the country. And I wonder, all is that being done within the Eurasian Economic Union framework, and I wonder what is happening to the other countries which are part of that. So therefore, how dangerous you see it currently and the future of the Eurasian Economic Union.
Okay, Mary Tchaikovsky.
Yes, I've got a little footnote and a question. Footnote, I think when you were talking about generations, new generation of leaders, it's worth mentioning that Zelensky actually spent a lot of the 1990s in Moscow. And he was traveling continually between, and he was quite a sort of bright young thing in Russian showbiz, and made quite a lot of money there. Right. So I think it's worth mentioning that at least. Right. Question: do you happen to know what the Russian in the Levada poll? What was the Russian for the distinction between Normalnaya Strana and great power? Because I mean, it seems to me that if I was looking at this from the Russian perspective, I would simply say that the question really is the question for validity, because to me, it's entirely possible for normal country and great power to be entirely compatible from a Russian perspective.
And final round, Mr. Ryan, the gentleman with the beard, sorry, don't hear me.
Yeah, Mikhailsky, a good rousing trust. I was going to similarly to Katya ask about the Eurasian Economic Union, how useful it seemed to by both Russia and the other members, and what future you think that.
4 questions. You don't have to answer them all, but pick up. Let's go to Anna first this time for a change, and then we'll come on to James.
Okay, yeah. Russia attacks Kazakhstan. I think that it's pretty implausible scenario, because whatever Russia gets out of Kazakhstan, more or less everything it wants. Yeah, it is an investor there. Kazakhstan exports oil and gas through Russia. Russian language is the language of official communication. It is support. It has state support. Yeah, it's very difficult to make some kind of realistic case that Russians are being discriminated because they are Russians in Kazakhstan. Of course, yeah, certainly political power is not in the hands of Russians, but it doesn't mean that there is kind of ethnic discrimination which can be pinpointed. Well, I can tell you if Russia wants something out of Kazakh leadership, it doesn't really cost it very much to get it done. Kazakhstan started, if Russia wanted to extradite somebody who found refuge in Kazakhstan because of the war, yeah, the Kazakh leadership is happy to oblige. The instances are quite congruent, I would say. In the Eurasian Economic Union, it depends how rigid the whole thing is. And it might be very rigid on paper in terms of legally binding agreements, but as the EU, because the whole thing is modeled on the EU. And the EU is very rigid. But to what extent it has some degree of flexibility? I will give you examples, because relationship between Russia and Belarus is still very different than relations between Russia and, say, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. There are things within these scriptures of Eurasian Union that would preclude it cooperate with China the way they do. Customs, all this trade. In the end, everybody closed their eyes. It does violate, strictly speaking, the freedom of trade within the Eurasian Economic Union, but cross-border trade with China continues in quite massive proportions, and somehow it's all kind of acceptable. Also, Eurasian Economic Union is expanding in a ways that it now creates more associations. It also bonds with other unions, with the ASEAN, with here, there. It might be on paper only. But now the tactics is not try to acquire more members, especially if they are not very willing, but to have some flexible arrangements. And I think that's how it would probably continue.
Tom.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Anna. To pick up on the Eurasian Economic Union, the example I know I've been studying most is Armenia, where I think the problem for Armenia is that in the short to medium term, it's extremely advantageous. Armenian GDP, I think, has doubled in the last 3 years. But I think Armenians also know they're in a bit of a trap. They'd like to diversify their economy in the longer term. And obviously you can't do free trade agreements certainly with the EU, with Western countries in the same way if you're a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. So they're in a bind there, in which it's like a kind of, it's a nice drug in the shorter term, but it's a problem in the longer term. And Russia obviously behaves very arbitrarily. Russia banned Armenian dairy products arbitrarily early on in the war, sort of closed the border with Georgia, which is its main land border. For all of which reasons, Armenia is desperately trying to, the Armenian government is desperately trying to look for other options, but it's very hard to kind of wean yourself off this very, this very good status quo. Mary, where are you? Hidden by you. Yeah, the Levada question, I think, we can look it up, but it was a longer question. It was, do you want Russia to be a great power which is feared and respected by the world, or a normal country which has a higher standard of living? So I think there was a kind of binary there that do you prioritize greatness, velika državnost, over living standards. As for Zelensky, that's an interesting point. But I think that Zelensky is not, if he spent time in Russia, not in the same way that Aliyev or Tokayev did, not by becoming a part of the Russian elite. He's a bit like Pashinyan in that sense. He's a member of a bit of a counter elite.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just want to.
Yeah, no, but I think that, but it's an interesting point, and for sure, a lot of these Ukrainian leaders, they have relatives in Russia still, despite what's going on.
We've got time for another final round of questions. I've got one of my own. Anybody else like to raise their hand on screen or in the room? Now's the time to do so. Well, let me start off with my question while people are thinking about other questions. I started with something Anna said about Moldova, which is not a country I know. She said that a lot of people in Moldova feel closer to Russia than to the West. So my question is in two parts. Firstly, could you explain sort of why that is the case? And secondly, what should the EU and the US do about their Moldova policy in order to promote freedom in Moldova and to make sure it doesn't fall into Russia's grasp? So that you can both comment on that. Now, a footnote of the question, which is possibly aimed at much as catchy as the two panelists. The Belarus is planning to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I gather. Why and what benefits can it get from doing so?
Belarus joining
Belarus joining SCO.
yeah.
Why? What's the story there? Anybody else like to ask a question? Yes, Brian.
Yes. Isn't a competition for influence in Central Asia between Russia and China going to be the most likely cause of a falling out between those two powers?
I think that's my SCO question, really. Any final hands raised online? If not, we'll come back to our two panelists and give Katja a chance to answer any points she wishes to as well. Katja, why don't you go first?
Yes, yeah, thank you. I don't know much about that, to be honest, but I think that within the past, since 2020, August 2020, strategy of the current regime in Belarus, it's been really, with the sanctions, cut off from most of its trade with the EU. 70% of it has been overtaken by Russia, and I think it's an attempt to diversify, first of all, economically, as well as have more solid political backing, as Lukashenko still is obviously not recognized by the EU or by the US. And he probably feels that if he's part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS, that Belarus also wants to become part, he feels more legitimate and he has more sort of political recognition, as well as probably seeing it as a tool to promote Belarus trade relations with countries other than the EU and Russia. It's again an attempt to maneuver, but now not between Russia and the West, but Russia and Asia Pacific and Africa. So I can see it within this this trend.
Thank you. Anna, then we'll finish with Tom.
Oh, okay,
Any
all
further
right.
points, Anna?
I just wanted to bring out some figures, but okay. Why population in Moldova started to have maybe a bit more Russia-friendly views than, say, 2 years ago when the war when Ukraine has started. A resentment of the current government and a resentment of its policies. And many people lost out in weakening of ties with Russia. Inflation has been 33%, some ridiculous figures. Prices for public energy were shot up. Moldova cannot really export much of its produce to the West. Even if it does join European Union, I'm not sure. Well, it's kind of, it will have to compete with like much higher quality and kind of level of competition rather than market in Russia, which is, of course, less demanding, less barriers to entry. So yes, population first, that's this, and the other kind of a radical pro-European path is not shared by everybody. And in that sense, it was probably some kind of too radical turn, geopolitical turn, turn in terms of traditional values, churches. That's all kind of. So we are. So I would say that the cause is the actions of the government rather than people watching Russian TV. That's what the EU and US should do. That's I have an answer. That I think that they should recognize that these people who feel kind of, as I would say, pro-status quo, they are legitimate. They are not Russian agents. They are not puppets manipulated, brainwashed by propaganda. They have a will and mind of their own. They have a political position or social position that has to be recognized. They should be included. It should be a debate. It should be a discussion. It should be moving gradually into more inclusive civic nation project rather than kind of being very much sort of driven between some sort of two stools, and it might end up not actually getting anywhere. So because quite a lot of assistance projects, programs, they are geared very much explicitly to kind of civil society organizations who are very much kind of part of that neoliberal project. And that's kind of people who are not part of it do not have a voice. And I think it would be good if the external actors, Western actors, would recognize that they probably should have a voice. And that's kind of normal. We would have it in our own societies, and it would be more kind of, it would be more inclusive and more and fair. Competition between Russia and China in Central Asia, I do not see it happening. I think that they're quite complementary. Chinese leadership has been always quite mindful of Russia's sensitivities. They also, I would say that Russia takes the first pick in terms of economic projects. They invest where they want to invest, and China takes the rest. I would say that. In terms of China always recognized that Russia has security interests, and it does promote its kind of security, its own security interests, but in a way that they would be kind of congruent with Russia. In terms of Belarus CSTO, well, they want to have good relations. They want to gain from China's economic growth. They see that, okay, without the center, the rise, like real rising power, we should be somehow in that club. We should be close to that. If they see the world from not from the kind of US-centric position, but from the China-centric position, it would appear kind of more aspirational.
Just before Tom finishes off, if Christian Danielson would like to say something, we'd like to hear from the Swedish Prime Minister's office. But if he wants to intervene, if he's not too busy, we'd be very welcome to have his view read out or live, whatever he prefers. But while he's thinking about if he wants to intervene, I'll turn to Tom to try and answer the last couple of points.
Yeah, well, I'm actually going to disagree with Anna, which makes life a bit more interesting on Moldova, because I was actually in a webinar yesterday on Moldova with a lot of people who know Moldova pretty well, including from Chisinau. We also have a paper, one of my exiled Russian colleagues, Maxim Samaruka, has been working on Moldova. I've been talking to him after his visit there. I think the ruling parties obviously had the Maya Sandu's parties had a rough time. The last few years, the economy has suffered from the war, but I think I see it more positively that they're decoupling from Russian gas. Closer, they're now connecting to the Romanian electricity network, and I think Sandu's party is still the most popular. It's unlikely to win an outright majority as it did last time. Moldovan politics, elections are won from the center by getting the kind of Moldovan people who are neither too pro-Romanian or too pro-Russian, and people have said that Sandu, I think, gets that. She won the last election by doing that, and she's, for example, been doing interviews in Russian. I think there are some positive signs. There's obviously going to be this referendum on EU membership at the same time as the presidential election in October. The predictions there is that turnout might be a bit tricky, but you're looking at about 60% support for the EU, and don't forget the diaspora also votes in those elections, which is quite considerable, and mostly within Europe. NATO membership definitely, NATO support definitely much lower, probably only 30%, and most people, want Moldova to stay neutral, not part of NATO. That has gone up a bit, I think, from sort of 20 to 30% roughly. I should check my figures. And also apparently people who want unionists who want union with Romania, that figure's also gone up and is 30+% in Moldova. But I think for sure, I think they've made some missteps, but I think they've handled the war situation pretty well. The economy, is incredibly exposed to the war, because of Odessa port and all sorts of things. I think Moldova is precarious, and I absolutely, do agree that these people who are out there who are not the obvious pro-Europeans need to be engaged with properly, and their views need to be taken seriously. But I do think from the discussions I was having yesterday, they were a bit more positive than what I.
Okay, well, good to have a slight disagreement at the end there. Christian Danielson had to go, so unless anybody else wants to intervene with a final comment, thought, or word, we'll say thank you very much to both our panelists for an excellent conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.